I happened to be at a Lutheran conference in Dayton, Ohio. It was almost 11 o'clock at night. As we came out, I looked over and I said, what kind of industry is that working all night long? Let's go over and look at it. It was a technical training college, and it was skill training. And I said, I'll be damned. I said, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. We don't have anything like that in South Carolina. I was running for governor, and I said, if I ever get the chance, that's the first thing I'm going to do. That's why I said I started it, because I had the idea in Dayton, Ohio. Fritz Hollings was elected governor in 1958, took office in 1959. At that time, we were in a dire economic situation.
I'm going to tell you exactly what this state looked like before technical colleges. It was textiles, manufacturing in a hot, dirty building, carrying very, very little money home.
South Carolina came from an agrarian state, and then the textile industry was the primary manufacturing industry for years. But in the 50s and 60s, both were in a state of decline as mechanization became available and they were becoming more productive, required less people.
The state was facing a real crisis. The economy was changing in a very significant way.
We were transitioning then from an agri state to a more urban state.
I was raised on a little tobacco farm. Tobacco farming, was just going away. There was a train that ran from Mullins up north.
No work on the farms for them, no industries, no business to work for. So here you had all these displaced people without jobs.
And they all caught the little train out of Mullins.
Their families would pack them a little lunch with fried chicken, and they'd go hop on a train and get off Detroit or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or wherever, and leave the chicken bones on the train. So they called it the Chicken Bone Express.
I left because I couldn't get the education I wanted. So when I left, I was part of the diaspora that was headed out of South Carolina. There were others who were leaving because they couldn't find employment.
South Carolina had a major outmigration. Those that couldn't find jobs on the farm, they were going to the automotive manufacturers in Michigan and the Northeast, wherever they could find work.
We lost a lot of people who just didn't see any opportunities in South Carolina. So Hollings and others saw that and knew something had to be done. The answer was we've got to turn farm hands into factory hands. And how do you do it? It's got to be through training.
We had a survey done in 1959, and it showed that 2/3 of our workforce were functionally illiterate. It also showed that less than 5% of our high school graduates went to college.
The graduates of the universities and the four-year colleges, in large measure, were going out of the state. Where could they work? If you had I had a degree in chemical engineering when I graduated Clemson, and when you interviewed the companies that were employing chemical engineers, most of them were in other states other than South Carolina. In fact, if you look at the demographics in the 50s, and I think Hollings was very perceptive on this, you had a major out-migration at all levels. Hollings himself made visits to the major industries across the country. As he talked with some of the potential employers, it was very clear that South Carolina had the people, and the people wanted jobs, but they were not skilled and they were not trained for the kind of jobs that were needed by these new employers. And he realized very quickly that if South Carolina would be successful, it had to have a resource base that would train the people of the state for the new jobs that would be created within the state.
Hollings recommended the appointment of this committee to outline what was needed to get industry in South Carolina. We first of all took a look at what our competitive states were doing.
The West Committee looked around at what other states were doing, especially North Carolina, and saw that they were getting major industries that moved in to diversify the economic base of the state, to offer new kinds of jobs, and the committee recommended the establishment of the system.
The charge was to create an adequate program of pre-employment and post-employment training to attract industry, and then to develop a post-secondary education program to meet the employment and business community needs in the state. They were not restrictive in any way, And that was the genius of the charge to create the system. Too many places prescribe everything in the law, and they get hemmed in and hampered and don't have the freedom to be creative, to find solutions to problems. And this system was born that way. And that's a fortunate thing, really fortunate.
The act creating the technical education program, I wrote on the back of a yellow piece of paper.
Actually, I wrote it. What happened was, once we started it and everything else, and I passed it in the House with John West, I knew I could get it by in the Senate. And I walked in the governor's office one day, and Muller Krebs was my chief of staff. And Muller said, "Governor, this killed your technical training." I said, "How you mean kill my technical training?" I said, "The House has just passed it and everything." He said, "Yeah, but they've got into a conference on the deficiency appropriations bill, and that's the last bill that they're going to pass. They're meeting right now, the conference committee, and Edgar Brown has knocked it out." I said, "Go down the hall and to Walter Brown. He'll have some liquor and get a bottle of bourbon." I walked across the street. I knew the elevator because I'd worked the elevator going through law school, and I went up to the third floor and opened the door. And here comes the big governor, said Senator Brown. I said, "Colonel, let's have a little touch." He said, "Now what do you want?" I said, "Let's have the touch first." Then we had one. He said, "Now what do you want?" I said, "You know exactly what I want. I need my technical training." "Oh," he said, "you don't want that. That's for the dummies." He said, "We closed that down." We kept on, and finally I said, "Well, you're going to make me out a liar." He said, "A liar?" I said, "Yeah, I promised Jacob Chuck to pay for their technical training." And well, he said, "We can't make the governor a liar." He said, "How much do you want?" I said, $364,000, just what they got in the House bill. "We can't have that. You get $250,000 so you won't be a liar. But don't start a program again." So he said, "Now, write it up quick." And he said, "We go pass it in the morning. It's got to be ready tonight to go to the printer." So I started dictating it, and Jim Smith said, "Why don't we just take the House version?" And I said, "You smarter than me. We'll take the House, and then no back and forth and everything. It's settled." So the Senate will pass the House, and the House will pass it, and they've agreed to it, and that's it. And that's why I say I wrote it. But John West, I wrote it on a yellow pad. We didn't even look at his yellow pad. We took the House version. I was dictating it. I didn't know he'd written it out on a yellow pad.
I was totally a supporter of it. I had served on the Constitutional Study Committee with Senator John West, and he and Fritz Hollings, as governor, was really pushing it, and they had done a lot of the studying and the research to establish the necessity for it and the practicality of it. And I was just on board from the start.
The textile industry, well, they didn't want to damn compete. They weren't going to raise their taxes to pay for skills.
They wanted their workers standing on the street corner waiting to be recalled back to work. They didn't want them to be trained for something that they would leave. So they resisted us heavily in the beginning.
The Chamber of Commerce, the textile industry, and the educators wanted to slam the door. They thought we were starting technical training in the regular public schools and stuff like that. By the way, local financing financed it. We didn't have any money. I was broke. I got that $250,000 from Edgar, but the state only put in 15%. So the Lex Walters really sold it in the communities, kept selling it. I mean, we had to work. We had a hell of a time, but we got it passed.
Stan Smith was designated the chairman, and I well remember talking to Governor Hollings about the membership. Stan's name came up, and somebody said, "But Governor, I don't believe he voted for you." Fritz said, "Don't give a damn. If he's the right man, he's it."
At the inaugural meeting in his conference room, Governor Hollings sent word in by Sap Funderburg, one of the members, elect Smith chairman. So Sap made the motion, and it passed unanimously, which is a thrill. I was surprised too. I don't know whether he appointed me because I was close by in the town, or as he said, this guy could get something done. After the dust cleared, 6 unusual men, not a single one of them had a political axe to grind, not one. So we sat around the table and just looking at ourselves and said, well, let's have a philosophy. Let's have a 2-sentence philosophy. Every South Carolinian shall have the right to seek his or her own natural destiny. Sentence 1. Sentence 2, there must be dignity in all honorable work. And that was the philosophy before we did anything. Fritz Hollings studied the North Carolina system, and he recruited Walter Harper, which was a brilliant development man. And Walter, in turn, led him to Wade Martin. Wade was outside the door when we first convened. So my first job as chairman is to elect Wade Martin, executive director.
I stole 3 NC State graduates. One was Walter Harper, who designed the research triangle. I stole him, and he was fundamental on industry. Wade Martin for technical training, and Jerry Albright from Southern Pines. He headed up my tourism. And Luther Hodges and I were close friends. He called me up. He just returned from a trip to Russia. "You've taken Jerry Albright. You've taken everybody from me." I said, "Take one more trip to Russia and I'll move Mrs. Hodges down."
The concept evolved that we should have a post-high school educational program that a student could commute to within 30 minutes of his home, often at night.
When the leadership of the state first came in, when Wade Martin was the first system director.
Wade Martin was a great advisor and that leader in that, because he had done the same thing in North Carolina. He'd done a few things he didn't approve of.
One of the first things he did was put in place a master plan for the state. Unlike North Carolina, they said when they put their 2-year college system in, any county that wants one of these institutions, if you put up $500,000, the state will match it so that you can build your own institution. In South Carolina, they said we're going to put a system in place based on the demographics of the state, not the politics of the state, and we're going to look at the population densities of the state in hopes that we could serve 95% of the population of the state within a 30-mile radius of one of these technical education centers.
And let me tell you the real secret now. Stan Smith headed it up and did a magnificent job, but the best break I got was Wade Martin.
Wade Martin, he was not a strong administrator. He had to have somebody right under him to administer the program, but he was a visionary. Thank goodness that he developed the master plan for the system. There were 3 parts of the legislation. The special schools programs are programs designed for those new jobs being created in the state. The credit programs for those recent high school graduates so that they could prepare for the jobs and the new that were being created. And then also to provide for those already employed so that they can update their skills to be more benefit to their employer.
We devised the criteria for 14 technical centers that would cover the state, and no South Carolina would have to drive more than 30 miles.
The North Carolina schools were called Industrial Education Centers, IECs. In South Carolina, when the name was put in place here, they dropped the word industrial and added the word technical education centers. And I think that broadened the perspective somewhat, not just focused on the industries of the state, but broadened to all the programs that were technical in nature.
The immediate remedy to get industry was the special schools program.
We did have the exodus, and we had to find some way to keep these folks here. And I still think special schools was the foundation of the technical college system. It put people to work.
The special schools was part of that in the very beginning, what we now know as Ready SC. It was the creation of the colleges, and that was technical education centers, I guess, at that time. That was one part of the plan, but the other part was this industrial training called special schools, and it was kind of a crash training course. So even before we could get the colleges up and going, before we could turn out graduates with these skills, we could go out and tell businesses in the Northeast, if you'll bring a manufacturing plant to South Carolina, we will study your processes, we will develop a training program, and day one, when you're ready to flip that light switch on and get your assembly line or whatever going, we will have the people trained for you, and that won't cost you a dime. We will do that. And well, that was new then. People said, wow, I mean, that's a pretty good deal. And it worked. It was successful from the very, very beginning. Since those days, it's been copied by, I guess, about everybody around the country, but South Carolina still does it best.